guys, welcome along. This is one of the first introductory videos into our studied poetry section. Obviously studied poetry at this stage, we're more than aware that it's 12.5% of our grade, 50 marks, a really good chunk of material going towards our paper 2 paper as well. Again, this is one of the areas that I suppose holds the most fear and trepidation for most students, considering that in order to have a choice in the paper, you'll have to look at 6 out of the 8 poets that are there, and you'll have to cover 6 poems per poet as well. So we're talking about 36 poems. I know in a lot of day schools out there, it takes up a majority of our time as well over both 5th and 6th year of our course. So we're going to launch into it straight away, and we're going to hopefully dispel a couple of myths and rumours about this topic and make sure that we get very much on top of this material and understand that there's a lot of little tips and tricks that we can do and implement in order to achieve the best possible grade for this section. Okay, so let's dive straight in. So effectively what we are dealing with, as I said, the topic of today's class is our studied poetry, 12.5%. Again, same percentage breakdown as our paper 1 question A question, and same percentage breakdown as our paper 1 question B question. Obviously we've done a little bit of work on that before, we've done a couple of videos on those 2 topics as well, but just not losing sight of the fact that this is the difference between 2 or 3, potentially 3 grade points. So again, it deserves and warrants our attention, okay? As a brief rule of thumb, I know that unseen poetry kind of takes us out of this angle a little bit, but as a rule of thumb, it's very much kind of 1 minute per mark in terms of our paper 2, but it's about 50 minutes, and it's going to be about, so for 50 marks. So we're going to spend about 50 minutes on this topic, potentially 55 minutes if you do really struggle with your poetry, okay? Guys, we're going to try and aim for a minimum of 4 A4 pages. And we're going to try for a maximum of 6. We don't really want to be writing more than 6 pages. And again, I know that sounds like a lot of material, but we do have that 50-55 minute window to get this information down. Realistically, it should be taking us around 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes per A4 page, certainly after our mocks as well. Okay, so we don't want to be writing more than 6 pages. And despite what you may have been told in terms of the department marking scheme, we are looking for a minimum of 4 poems. And even at that, we really feel here that it's very difficult to achieve absolute best marks with just dealing with 4 poems. We always tell our students here to go with point by point structure. We try and gravitate towards that structure. And if you are going point by point, it's easier to use 5 and then 6 poems as well. All right. What I would be looking for you guys to do here is mentioning a minimum of 5 poems, and then even at that, at least mentioning a 6th poem as well before you finish, okay? So that's effectively what we're looking at there, 4, 5, 6 poems for each individual poet. We're going to go back to this a lot in today's class as well. As we said, this is an introductory session in terms of what I should be doing when I'm putting pen to paper for my studied poetry question. But we're going to come back to this a lot, LOQ. What is the specific language of the question, all right? Whether we're aware of this or not, there are always 2 parts to every studied poetry question. The 2 parts will invariably ask us about the subject matter, about the content that the poet is trying to put across, and then also stylistically speaking, how do they put that material across, okay? So we need to be very mindful of our LOQ. Certainly in the second of these videos, when we start looking at our specific studied poets, what we'll do is we'll look at past paper questions, and we'll basically confirm the fact that there are 2 parts, and we'll confirm the significance of LOQ. Finally, and the main aspect of today's video is that we're going to establish nice and clearly what is the structure. All right, what is the clear, well-developed structure for a studied poetry answer? This is something I come back to in the grinds a lot. It's something I'll talk about in these videos a lot, is the optics of my essay. How good does my essay look, and how accessible is it for an examiner? Okay, so that's effectively, guys, your brief overview for the studied poetry. These are the things that we need to keep in the forefront of our mind. And when we are engaging in pragmatic revision and pragmatic study, which is what everybody should be doing, you should be taking these past paper questions and asking yourself, okay, can I put pen to paper on this? Can I understand the language of this question? Can I jot down maybe how I would potentially link my poems together, and how would I construct a very decent, certainly the best essay that I could do, all right? So that's what we're going to talk about today, guys. We're going to move on to the middle board here now, and we're going to talk about our introduction. We're going to talk about the 2 different structures that we can go about, which is point by point or poem by poem. Again, there is no prejudice either way, whatever style you want to go with. As I said moments ago, we tend to here in the academy gravitate towards point by point because what it allows for is that conversational flow, that holistic appreciation of poetry that we're ultimately looking to try and achieve when we're responding to a poetry essay. Again, poetry falls very much under aesthetic language, and if we remember, how do we define aesthetic language? Well, aesthetic language is designed to evoke a response. It's designed for us to comment on, well, what's my opinion about this and how do I feel about this? All right, so impact you'll see on the board a couple of times, you're going to be talk about a number of times today as well. That's always, what are my thoughts? What are my feelings? What's my opinion? What's the emotion that I'm feeling towards this poem? And again, remember guys, like all of our essays, if you don't feel the emotion and you don't have any kind of really significant thoughts either way, we fake it. We tend to lie and we tend to bolster our responses with plausible and very decent terminology and language as well that supports our point, okay? So with regards to our introduction, I'm going to walk us through what's called a point-by-point structure first. The difference between the two is point-by-point structure allows us to come up with what's called areas of focus and specific points that you're looking to try and prove within your answer. Poem-by-poem is simply using the language of the question and dealing with individual poems, 6 individual poems. Here's this poem, here's how it reflects the language of the question. Next poem, same, next poem, same. So nothing too wrong with that. The only issue is, and tends to, what happens with students is that they tend to summarize the poems and they tend to simply tell us what is happening in the poem rather than bringing it back to the language of the question. And again, where summary is the dirty word of English. We don't want to tell the examiners anything, we want to show them our response, okay? So, that's our poem by poem and point by point structure. When we are trying to create these areas of focus, it just solidifies and it cements our angles much greater. If we can comment on 1 or 2 poems that really highlight this topic, this is the thing the poet likes to talk about. Why do we think that? Well, because we can clearly see it here being used over the course of 2 poems. Well, that really cements what's going to be our thesis, which we'll talk about now in a minute. It really cements our response and our answer, okay? So, if we dive straight in terms of our introduction, there are some things that you can do and that you should be doing, and then there are other things down here which I would encourage you to do, and we certainly here in the English department would encourage you to do to help bolster and strengthen your answer, okay? These things really have to be done in terms of you have to answer the question. Now you can do that as basic and as simplistic, in the most simplistic manner as you want. You can mention the poet, which again has to be done, and you can talk about a little bit of an impact, a little bit of response. I like this poet, this is what I thought, this is how I felt. And that's all really, really good. And you're going to bring in specific LOQ. We go back to that, guys, specific language of the question. And that's absolutely fine, and they're the things that I would argue, have to do, okay? If we're going to try and break out of that kind of H4, H5 black hole that is the English Leaving Cert, and we really want to grow and develop our responses, there's a couple of things that we should be trying to do. First off, when we go back here and we look at answering the question, the really good students, or rather the really astute students, will be able to challenge the language of the question, all right? At least in part. Okay, now as I said, we'll get onto this in the second video today in terms of taking on a specific studied poet and how we might challenge the specific language of that question. But you might get something along the lines of a poet says, or the language of the question reads, that this particular poet's poetry is dark and depressing, full stop. And you might not want to talk about how dark and depressing it is. By and large, you probably will. 80% of the response will be that way inclined. But you might want to show off your ability of dissection, show off your understanding of poetry. And then you might say, you know what, however, to simply say that the work of X is dark and depressing, we feel marginalizes that poet and actually does her a disservice. That there's 1 or 2 poems that have a jovial, playful, kind of a didactic response to them. And then again, what you're doing is you're just showing the examiners your ability to open up your answer. You're showing that you're different level in terms of your response, okay? So we're going to try certainly to challenge the language of the question, at least in part, okay? That's the first thing that we're going to try and add on. The second thing that I would encourage every single person watching this video is that we try and include what's called a hook. Now, if you've ever been in one of my classes before, either day school or grind classes, you'll know how obsessed I am with the concept of a hook. A hook, guys, is just something new, different, unique and exciting that starts our essay off. So then an examiner just doesn't look at it and goes, the poet I studied this year was Elizabeth Bishop. I really liked her work. The 6 poems I covered were... And that's fine, and you can do that, and you can go through the motions, and you can tick those boxes. However, if we include potentially a quote from the poet, or now maybe from one of the 6 poems we've looked at, or a quote she said about her own work, if you look at something a critic has potentially said, and you're going to use that, and you're going to challenge it or agree with it, you're going to use potentially a quote from one of your favourite novels that you feel reflects the poet's work, anything along those lines is exceptional. Okay, one of the most interesting, and I'm not suggesting this, but one of the most interesting openings to a poetry essay I ever read was the individual had compared a particular line from Terminator 2, one of their favourite movies, to the work of this individual poet. Now, I'm not suggesting that we try and go down that angle, but again, it worked very, very well in that case, okay? So we're going to try and include a hook, something new, something unique, something different, to make the examiner aware of, well, this is a different level of a response. The second thing that we're ultimately going to try and do is include a thesis. Now this is very, very similar to, if we go back here, to answering the question. But what you're going to do is you're going to frame it in terms of this is your idea, this is your concept that you're ultimately going to try and prove within your answer, okay? So again, in our second, third, fourth video and all the other videos that we look at with regards to the specific study poetry, we'll have examples of these theses. But just to start to think about it, that again, what we do is we use the language of the question and we use our response and our impact, and we almost amalgamate all of it to give ourselves a thesis, a concept that we're ultimately going to try and prove. The final thing, again, I have a little star beside this here because this is arguably my favorite technique, this tertiary rule of 3 technique. Again, it's something I mention constantly in the grinds. I would talk about this for Hamlet, for King Lear, for your comparative, for your study poetry, whatever. I think this is a phenomenal technique to use at the very beginning of our answers. Again, what the rule of 3 is mentioning 3 things in quick succession. It's a manipulative technique, all right? You get collected here late from the grinds. You don't want to go home and have food, that you want to go across straight away to McDonald's, and your mum collects you and she's like, how did you get on in grinds? And you say, Mum, don't talk to me. I'm exhausted, I'm freezing, and I am starving. 3 things in quick succession, again, manipulative technique. In the same way here, what you're going to do in your introductory points within your study poetry essay is you're going to tell the examiner the 3 areas of focus you're going to look at. You look at maybe a poet like Paul Durkin, for example, and what you'll mention here is you'll mention the fractured and difficult relationship that he had with his father. You'll mention the wavering and subsequent divorce with his wife Nessa, and then you'll mention the fear and trepidation with regards to the Americanization of Ireland. And you'll do it in such a way that it'll be 1 sentence, maybe 2 sentences max. You've now told the examiner your areas of focus. You've told them how you're going to seamlessly integrate the 6 poems that you've looked at under those areas of focus, okay? So it's a really, really nice technique just to blueprint your essay. In terms of optics, we go back to that word I was speaking about a few moments ago. It works really, really well just to map out to the examiner, these are the things I'm intending to talk about today, okay? So, have to do these things, should do these things, all right? So we start to consider those and we start to consider how do we bolster and how we make our essay a little bit better. If we do all of these things together, which as I said, I'm encouraging you to do, that's going to take us up to around a half an A4 page, okay? We like to see the slightly longer introductions. The reason being is because once I get through that, as I said, I have a nice blueprint, a nice understanding of which way the essay is going to go. All right? So that's our introduction, guys. When we get on to point by point, and I understand 90% of day schoolers out there will be looking at a poem by poem structure. If that is the case, if you're in 5th year and you're looking again to maximize your grade, well then you really starts to adopt the point by point structure. If you're in 6th year, and it's certainly after the mocks, and you've been getting really, really good grades with regards to the poem by poem, well maybe stick to that and you might be able to amalgamate a couple of different ideas within that, okay? It is just another option. As we said, the poem by poem option, very similar. Let's call a spade a spade. They're very similar. We just might do a little bit more linking. Very similar to our comparative in the sense of linking language, linking our poems forward, linking our poems back, okay? If we go with a point by point structure, we're going to start with a topic sentence. Nice and clear, telling the examiners this is the area of focus I intend to look at, and specifically, well, why are you looking at it? Well, because it goes back to this particular part of the language of the question, okay? You are showing the examiner why this is so important, all right? If you look at Bishop, for example, and you're talking about her stark moments of realization, these deep insight epiphany moments, well, then you're going to mention In the Waiting Room and First Death in Nova Scotia. Why are you talking about those two poems? Well, clearly they're the best poems that reflect this idea within her work, which obviously shows its significance, okay? You're going to, as I've just done there, potentially mention two poems that are either similar to one another in terms of stylistic features, that potentially chronologically speaking might have been written in around the same time, or thematically, and this is a big thing we try and drive home here, that thematically they're actually similar poems. So you're showing that here there's two poems that are very, very similar in terms of the thematic approach, effectively guys, what they're about, but ultimately then what you might deal with them is say that they're stylistically speaking completely different, thus showing the ability and how amazing that poet is, that he or she can talk about the same subject matter but deal with it in two very, very different ways, okay? We're going to tell the examiner, we're going to mention potentially two poems that we're going to try and show links together, and then we just launch into our first poem, alright? And then we deal with our first poem as if we're going through a poem by poem structure. However, we're not going to segregate. I did mention at the start of this video that there are two parts to every studied poetry question, subject matter and style. We're not going to segregate those two, okay? Yes, we might tell the examiner a little bit about context and what the poem is about very, very briefly, but you're going to try for an amalgamation of the two. And if you don't know what amalgamation means, it's a means of bringing together, or joining together, okay? So typically what you're going to do is you're going to launch in to talk about the content, the subject matter, what it's about, and the significance. That's all you're talking about. Again, you're only going to talk about what is significant within that poem. And then what you're going to do is you're going to use the stylistic elements, similes, metaphors, comparisons, sensuous language, anthropomorphism, whatever it is. You're going to then use that to show and to deliver the fact that this is the content and this is a significant content, okay? So effectively the point I'm making here, guys, is that it's an amalgamation of the two. You're not going to compartmentalize those parts of the studied poetry question, okay? Now, you are constantly, this is the most important word for your English Leaving Cert, okay? And that's paper 1 and paper 2. If you've watched any of the other videos, you'll hear me constantly talking about impact, 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 and your impact. We go back, what are your thoughts and how do you feel towards what it is that you're looking at? And poetry is almost above all else because of the nature of aesthetic language, one of our 5 categories of language, okay? How did this aesthetic language impact upon me? What did I think and how did I feel? You're going to try and give that constantly throughout, okay? The best thing that we're looking for, and we've said it multiple times in the videos and the grinds, we need to be able to hear your voice. In a response, we need to get a sense of your personality, we need to be able to hear your voice. So a lot of, I thought this, it was my understanding, on initial reading I felt X, however, after 2 or 3 readings, I felt Y. Those are the kind of little one-liners that really elevate our grade, okay? So we're not going to try and include that constantly, okay? And then what I have here written for us is a mini conclusion. And the reason why it is a mini conclusion is because you are boxing off that individual poem, all right? You've dealt with that poem, you're now having a line break, which again, for a lot of us, a line break is a new paragraph, and then you're going to start the next paragraph, okay? Now, the mini conclusion will wrap up, as I said, that poem, and you're going to maybe talk about potentially and clearly, because of the subject matter such as X and how Bishop or Durkin or whomever dealt with it, that's obviously why they felt strongly about this or whatever it is, something along those lines, okay? And then that's boxed off. And then we're moving on to the second poem, but we're still remaining on that same, we go back here, our topic sentence, our first area of focus, okay? So then we are still on the second poem, or still on, launching into our second poem, but still remaining on the first area of focus. So once we've had that line break and we're moving on to our second poem, again, as I said, we're still on that same area of focus, okay? So again, whether you're looking at Boland, for example, Boland in terms of social, political and personal commentary within her work, her social elements, the likes of Shadow Doll and the Famine Road, well, they seamlessly go together to highlight her social experiences and what she wants to talk about from a social angle, social commentary. Her political angle, you look at the sectarian violence in Warhorse and Child of Our Time, for example, and her personal episode, you might look at This Moment and the Pomegranate. And that's the way that I'm talking about in terms of point by point. They become areas of focus and the poems go together. So if we take Durkin maybe just as an example, and you have Ireland 2002, and that might have been our first one here. That nice little couplet deals with a fear and trepidation about the Americanization of Ireland. And then you have maybe the second poem, which is Wife Who Smashed Television Gets Jail. Another perfect poem that deals with that fear and trepidation surrounding Americanization. You launch into that second poem and you highlight to the examiner that you're still talking about that same area of focus, the trepidation around the Americanization of Ireland. You potentially show, and this is where the point by point really comes into its own, a potential link between the first one that you're talking about. Now, for the students who have found this completely easy, this is something that you potentially might try in the first paragraph. You might link forward to the next poem that you deal with. You can kind of seamlessly talk about the two poems almost together. You can also do it here in terms of linking back to the first poem that you mentioned also, okay? So that's a really, really nice idea and really highlights and cements that point by point structure. So potential links throughout. You deal with your second poem, very similar to the fact that you've dealt with the first one, very similar way. Impact throughout, style and content throughout, and the amalgamation as discussed between the two. And then the real big change here is you have much more of a full conclusion. And that full conclusion concludes the first area of focus. And you're telling the examiner that obviously and now evidently that this individual wants to talk about this subject matter and has done, not just in one, but two of their works, okay? And then you box that off and you talk about your response then finally to that area of focus. And that's done. And that effectively is, those two poems then are done as well. And that's effectively your first area of focus. You won't come back to those two poems again, nor should you come back to those two poems again. It's what we call bouncing. And again, what it does is it takes away from the other poems that you're going to talk about as well, okay? So guys, all of that together, as in an area of focus, is realistically going to run to about 1.5 A4 pages. It's about 3/4 of an A4 page per poem. Within that, don't be afraid. You know, if you want to make 1 line break, if you want to have 2 line breaks, 3 line breaks, something we've said here in the Academy constantly is that line breaks are your friends. It's another great way to go back to the language of the question, reaffirm to the examiner what you're talking about. Again, optics just gets us marks, really good structure, okay? And you're going to do that effectively, guys, 3 times, okay? So if you can imagine, first area of focus is an A4 page and a half. Once you've done a second one, that brings us up to 3 pages. You do a third one, it brings us up to 4.5, plus our half an A4 page introduction brings us up to around 5 A4 pages. And then finally, the final element, final structural point with regards to our studied poetry question is our conclusion, okay? Now the first thing to note about the conclusion is gone are the days of the half an A4 page conclusion, gone are the days of, as I've said within my essay, or as I've said throughout, I said X, Y, and Z. We want to try and avoid that insofar as possible. We want shorter, more succinct responses in our conclusion, okay? And effectively what we're trying to revert to, we're trying to revert or go back to our hook and go back to our thesis insofar as possible, okay? The hook, one of the best hooks I ever read, an individual was a Sylvia Plath essay. She had started her essay with a quote from Sylvia Plath that read, "I am myself, that is not enough." So often when we engage with her as a poet, we are plagued, or we are dealing with a speaker who's plagued by insecurity. It's a phenomenal opener. She then reverted back to that in her conclusion. It worked incredibly well. So we're going to try and do something like that insofar as possible. But more importantly, we're going to go back to our thesis, guys. And what you need to treat the ending of your studied poetry answer as is effectively an argument with the, albeit a very polite one, with the examiner. And you're ultimately going, look, this is what I set out to prove. I set out to prove that yes, this particular poet does talk about this subject matter and deals with it in a very rich and varied stylistic manner. And now you've just seen me do that over the course of a sample of their work over the course of the 6 poems. So you're effectively saying, look how well I have proven what I set out to prove. Okay, very mathematical in that regard, and it works really, really well. There is that option to fall back on the rule of 3. If you are struggling with it, feel free to go back to the rule of 3. But I would argue that it's really about the thesis and that final element of conversational flow to our essay. Okay, and that'll be our conclusion, guys. As we've said a number of times, with regards to length, and it's not about quantity, we know that, it's very much about quality, it's about that holistic conversational flow within our answer. But if you are one of those individuals that you just kind of think, right, quantitatively, I need to know how much do I need to write? Well, 5.25, 5.5 pages is the perfect amount. And as we've mapped this out now, this now becomes a tick the box exercise. Have I launched into my next point with a very clear topic sentence? Have I told the examiner my intentions within this point? Have I used 1 or 2 poems to prove the angle that I'm taking there, to prove that the poet uses this particular type of poetic language, to prove this area of focus? And have I gone about it in an extensive, and as we've said, conversational, very much holistic manner, okay? So structurally speaking, this should be the first video that you engage with, and maybe go back to 2 or 3 times before you look at engaging with any studied poet. This will not change, no matter who the poet is. You can have a look at as many varied different years across the past examination papers, and you can see that invariably there are 2 points and 2 areas to talk about, and you can see invariably that if we stick to a nice, clear, cohesive structure, you have to get significant marks in your response. Okay, so guys, that's our first introductory piece, our time management, our page length, how many poems you should be dealing with, and then the structure that we should adhere to. If we consider very briefly a little asterisk on this talk, that if we were to go by poem, you can see it doesn't really change massively. We're simply not going to mention the 2 poems at the start of the paragraph. We're going to mention the 1, and then we're going to deal with that poem in its entirety. You'll have a stronger kind of singular poem introduction, and then you'll have that, like, I suppose, a full conclusion for that poem each and every time, 6 times. Okay, so guys, that's it. That structure, those are the kind of angles, that tick the box exercise that we need to be engaging with. As I said, in the next couple of videos, when we start dealing with specific poets, we'll then start looking at actual past paper questions, and we will then start to implement this structure with regards to each and every one. Okay, hope you found that helpful, and we'll touch base on the other study poets. Thanks guys.